The day my son sold my house while I was recovering from surgery did not begin with shouting, arguments, or even a warning. It began with silence, the kind that settles in places where trust once lived. My name is Margaret Holloway. I am 71 years old, and until recently I lived in Asheville, North Carolina, in a white, two-story home tucked between old oak trees, a house I paid for over 30 years of careful saving, sacrifice, and deliberate choices. I had raised my children there, buried my husband from there, and built a life rooted so deeply in those walls that I believed nothing short of death would remove me from it. Before I go any further, I want to pause and ask you something. Where are you watching or listening from right now? Please write your city or state in the comments, because knowing where you are helps me remember that this story exists beyond just me. At the time this all began, I was lying in a hospital bed recovering from what doctors assured me was a routine surgery, uncomfortable but alert, sore but fully aware of my surroundings and my decisions. I had given my son temporary access to my affairs, temporary, limited, and clearly defined, because I believed the boy I raised to respect honesty would honor that boundary. He visited me once during my recovery, standing beside my bed with the same face he wore as a teenager when he thought he was doing the right thing but didn't want to explain it. He told me not to worry, that everything was handled, that I should focus on healing. I believed him, because trust built over decades doesn't collapse all at once. It cracks quietly, one assumption at a time. What I didn't know was that, while I was counting ceiling tiles and listening to machines hum through the night, he was meeting with a real estate agent, signing documents, and negotiating the sale of the only home I had ever truly known, all without my consent and without a single conversation that included my voice. He justified it later by saying he was protecting me, that the house was too much for someone my age, that I wouldn't be able to manage stairs, repairs, or the responsibilities that come with independence. But protection does not happen behind someone's back, and care does not erase ownership. The first sign that something was wrong came when my neighbor called my hospital room, her voice hesitant, asking if everything was all right because she had seen unfamiliar cars parked in my driveway. I remember the moment vividly, the weight in my chest, the way the room seemed to tilt as confusion gave way to dread. I asked her what she meant, and she told me there was a sign on my lawn, a for sale sign. In that instant, the reality I had trusted fractured completely. I asked my nurse to bring me my phone, my hands shaking not from weakness but from the effort of keeping calm. When I called my son, he didn't answer. I called again, and again. Hours passed before he finally picked up, his voice controlled, measured, already prepared. He told me it was done, that the paperwork was signed, that it was for the best, and that I would understand once I was feeling better. He spoke as though my absence from the decision made it easier, as though surgery had reduced my authority along with my mobility. I lay there listening, unable to interrupt, realizing that my life had been rearranged while I was sedated, my agency dissolved under the excuse of concern. That house was not just wood and stone. It was proof of every choice I had made to stand on my own, to remain independent long after others expected me to lean. And now, without asking, without permission, without honesty, it was gone. In that hospital bed, staring at the blank wall across from me, I felt something shift permanently inside me. Not rage, not despair, but clarity. Because when someone decides your life is easier to manage without you involved, they reveal exactly how little they value your voice. And in that moment, still recovering, still underestimated, I understood that what had been taken from me was not just my home, but the illusion that age makes betrayal less likely. In the days that followed, I replayed every conversation I had ever had with my son, searching for the moment I should have seen this coming, the moment when trust quietly turned into entitlement. Lying in that hospital room, my body still weak and stitched together, I felt the strange humiliation of realizing that my physical vulnerability had been mistaken for mental surrender. Nurses came and went, kind and efficient, unaware that while they monitored my vitals, the foundation of my life was being dismantled without my consent. My son visited again 2 days later, bringing flowers that smelled too strong for the small room and a smile that never reached his eyes. He spoke quickly, confidently, explaining the sale as if it were a solved equation. He said the market was right, that the offer was too good to pass up, that he was thinking ahead because someone had to. When I asked him how he could sign anything without my approval, he leaned back in his chair and reminded me, gently, almost kindly, that I had given him power of attorney while I was in surgery. Temporary, limited, for emergencies only. He framed it as legality rather than morality, as if staying within the letter of the law excused stepping all over its spirit. He spoke about my future as if it were already mapped out, mentioning assisted living options, smaller spaces, less responsibility. Each word landed heavier than the last, not because they were unfamiliar, but because they carried an assumption that my preferences no longer mattered. I listened carefully, noticing how often he used the word we instead of you, how frequently he spoke in conclusions rather than questions. He didn't ask where I wanted to live, what I wanted to keep, or how I felt about leaving the home where I had lived half my life. He had already decided those answers on my behalf. When I told him I never agreed to sell the house, he sighed, the way people do when they believe they're dealing with stubbornness rather than dissent. He said I was emotional because of the surgery, that we could talk again when I was more rested. That was the moment I understood the danger of what he had done. He wasn't just taking my property. He was reshaping the narrative so that any objection I raised could be dismissed as confusion. I realized then that if I didn't respond carefully, every word I spoke could be used to support the version of events he preferred. So I stopped arguing. I asked questions instead. I requested copies of documents. I listened as he explained timelines, escrow, closing dates, and buyer conditions, revealing more details than he intended because he assumed I couldn't follow them. He underestimated the woman who had balanced budgets, negotiated contracts, and survived decades without leaning on anyone. As he spoke, I felt the initial shock settle into something steadier. The hospital room no longer felt like a place of recovery. It felt like a vantage point. I understood that before I could reclaim anything, I needed to see the entire shape of what had been done, because betrayal wrapped in legality requires patience, not panic. Once I was discharged from the hospital, I returned not to my home, but to a temporary arrangement my son had already organized without asking, a small furnished apartment he described as perfect for now. Walking into that space felt like stepping into someone else's life, one where my history had been packed away into boxes I hadn't touched. The walls were bare, the rooms unfamiliar, and every surface reminded me that I had been relocated, not helped. My son stood in the doorway watching my reaction closely, interpreting my silence as acceptance. He explained where things were, how the locks worked, which neighbors were nice enough, speaking with the satisfaction of someone who believed the hardest part was over. I nodded and thanked him, because by then I understood that visible resistance would only reinforce the story he was already telling others, that I was overwhelmed, emotional, incapable. What he didn't realize was that this forced displacement sharpened my focus. Without the distractions of my old routines, I had nothing but time to think, to review what had been done, and to trace every step that led to the sale of my house. I began making calls quietly, not to accuse, but to gather information. I spoke with the real estate agent, posing as a confused seller seeking clarification, and learned how confidently my son had represented himself as acting fully on my behalf. I contacted the title company, the bank, and the attorney involved, listening carefully to their explanations, noting the assumptions they made about my consent. Each conversation revealed how easily my voice had been replaced by pure authority, an authority borrowed, stretched, and used beyond its purpose. I realized then how dangerous convenience can be when paired with opportunity. People assume urgency excuses overreach, that acting for someone absolves them of acting against someone. I spent hours reviewing copies of documents, reading every clause slowly, recognizing familiar language that had once been my responsibility to protect others from. This wasn't unfamiliar territory. I had navigated contracts my entire life, But now I was seeing how those same tools could be used quietly to erase someone if no one stopped them. What struck me most was how calm everyone involved seemed. To them, this was just another transaction, another elderly homeowner being assisted into a new phase of life. They didn't question it because no one ever questions efficiency when it's wrapped in good intentions. Sitting alone in that unfamiliar apartment, surrounded by borrowed furniture and borrowed assumptions, I understood something deeply unsettling. Systems don't fail people like me. They work exactly as designed when no one insists on being heard. And in that realization, I knew that reclaiming what was taken from me would require more than outrage. It would require precision, timing, and the willingness to let those who underestimated me continue doing so, right up until the moment they couldn't anymore. As the days passed in that temporary apartment, I began to understand the full emotional cost of what my son had done, not just the loss of a house, but the quiet dismantling of a life I had built deliberately and without shortcuts. Every morning I woke up disoriented, reaching instinctively for light switches that weren't there, listening for familiar creaks in the floor that never came. Those small absences carried more weight than any argument ever could. My son called daily, checking in with a tone that suggested supervision rather than concern, asking if I was settling in, and reminding me that this arrangement was only until we figure out what's best. The word "we" continued to haunt me. It implied consensus where none existed and erased my role in decisions that defined my future. I noticed how quickly others adopted his language. Friends who visited spoke cautiously, praising him for being so responsible, telling me how lucky I was to have a child willing to take charge. I smiled and thanked them, aware that pushing back too hard would only confirm the version of me that had already been circulated. What they didn't see were the quiet moments when I sorted through the few boxes he had allowed me to bring, personal items selected by someone else, memories reduced to what fit easily in the trunk of a car. Family photographs were missing. Letters from my husband were gone. Items that held no market value but immense meaning had been left behind, already claimed by the house's new owners or quietly absorbed into my son's possession. I asked him about these things once, casually, and he brushed it off, saying they were probably misplaced and that we could look for them later. Later became a pattern, a way to delay acknowledgement without ever refusing outright. That was when I realized how thoroughly he had planned this, not just the sale, but the aftermath. He had anticipated my questions, my grief, even my silence. What he hadn't anticipated was my memory. I remembered every promise he had made me over the years, every conversation where he spoke about respecting independence, about never treating me like a burden. Those memories didn't weaken me, they clarified the betrayal. I wasn't dealing with an impulsive mistake. I was dealing with a decision made calmly, rationally, and without my consent. And once I accepted that, the confusion lifted. I stopped asking myself why and started asking how. How far had this gone? How many assumptions had been made on my behalf? How many people believed a story that excluded me entirely? The answers mattered because they would determine what came next. In that quiet apartment, surrounded by someone else's idea of what my life should look like, I began preparing, not emotionally, but strategically, for the moment when I would no longer be spoken for. By the second week, I had settled into a rhythm that appeared passive on the surface but was anything but. I let my son believe his plan had worked, that the hardest part, removing me from my home, was behind him. He began speaking more freely, assuming compliance where there was only calculation. He talked about how the money from the sale would be managed responsibly, how it would ensure I was taken care of, never once asking how I wanted it handled or whether I agreed with his interpretation of care. I listened closely to the language he used, because words reveal intention long before actions do. He spoke of my future as something smaller, quieter, less demanding, as if ambition and independence had expiration dates. Meanwhile, I began rebuilding my footing quietly. I requested complete copies of every document related to the sale under the guise of wanting to understand things better, and he complied, confident that paper would overwhelm me. I spent hours reviewing those documents line by line, nodding where authority had been stretched, where assumptions replaced explicit consent, and where urgency had been used to justify decisions that could have waited. I recognized the strategy immediately: act quickly, normalize the outcome, and rely on the idea that once something is done, it is too complicated to undo. That strategy only works when the person affected accepts finality. I did not. I began reaching out to professionals I had trusted in the past, people who knew my history, my competence, and my consistency. I spoke carefully, framing my questions around process rather than accusation, allowing facts to surface naturally. With each conversation, the picture grew clearer. The sale had moved fast, faster than necessary, and certain safeguards that should have involved me directly had been bypassed because no one insisted on hearing my voice. I also began documenting the emotional aspect of what had happened: the sudden relocation, the loss of access to my belongings, the decisions made without consultation. Because control is rarely just financial, it is psychological. At night, I lay awake in that unfamiliar apartment, not consumed by anger but by focus. I wasn't interested in punishing my son, I was interested in restoring truth. There is a difference. Punishment seeks release. Restoration requires discipline. And discipline, I had learned over a lifetime, is most effective when it is quiet, patient, and grounded in evidence. The more I uncovered, the more I understood that this situation had unfolded not because I was incapable, but because I was assumed to be. That assumption was the foundation of everything my son had done, and it was the weakest part of his plan. The first real shift came when I stopped being invisible to the people my son assumed would never question him. I arranged a meeting with an attorney I had worked with years earlier, someone who knew me not as a fragile parent, but as a capable client who asked the right questions and followed every detail. I did not arrive emotional or accusatory. I arrived organized, with documents neatly labeled, timelines clearly outlined, and a calm explanation of events that left little room for dismissal. As I spoke, I watched recognition replace skepticism on his face. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush me. He asked precise questions, the kind that separate misunderstanding from overreach. When I explained the limited scope of the power of attorney, the timing of the sale, and the absence of my consent, the room grew very quiet. That silence told me more than reassurance ever could. He explained carefully that while what my son had done was not unheard of, it was far from untouchable. Convenience had been mistaken for authority, and urgency had been used to bypass accountability. What mattered now was documentation, consistency, and timing. Leaving that office, I felt something I hadn't felt since before the surgery, a sense of alignment between my reality and the world outside my family. Word began to travel quietly. The real estate agent called with a tone that had shifted noticeably, suddenly careful, suddenly eager to clarify details. The title company requested follow-up information. People who had once accepted my son's version without question now wanted confirmation from me directly. I did not gloat. I did not confront. I simply responded when asked, calmly and factually, allowing truth to do the work it does best when given space. My son noticed the change before I mentioned anything. His calls grew shorter, his confidence thinner, his language less absolute. He began asking if I was feeling okay, if I was getting confused by paperwork, subtle attempts to reassert the narrative that had served him so well. I answered politely, never defensive, never reactive. Inside, however, I understood the balance of power had begun to shift. He had built his plan on the assumption that I would remain quiet, grateful, and disoriented. What he was encountering instead was something far more difficult to manage. A woman who had been underestimated long enough to see the entire board, and who was now making her moves without announcing them. When my son finally realized that things were no longer moving in the direction he expected, his behavior changed in ways that revealed more than any confession ever could. The calm certainty he once carried gave way to impatience, then irritation, then a quiet defensiveness he tried unsuccessfully to mask as concern. He began calling at odd hours, asking vague questions about who I had been speaking to, and whether I was getting advice from people who didn't understand the situation. Each question confirmed what I already knew, that the version of events he had carefully controlled was slipping beyond his reach. He started revisiting past conversations, rewriting them in real time, insisting he had explained everything clearly and that I had agreed, a tactic meant not to convince me, but to reassure himself. I listened without correcting him, because people reveal their weakest points when they try too hard to protect them. He suggested we meet, as a family, to clear the air, framing it as reconciliation, but the urgency in his voice told a different story. He needed consensus restored, needed witnesses to reinforce the narrative that I was difficult, emotional, unreasonable. I declined politely, saying I preferred to handle matters slowly and privately. That refusal unsettled him more than anger ever would have. Outside of our conversations, other changes were unfolding. People who had once spoken to me cautiously now asked direct questions. Friends stopped praising my son's responsibility and started asking whether I was all right with what had happened. Even relatives who had accepted his explanations began noticing inconsistencies. I watched all of this quietly, aware that I did not need to convince anyone. Facts were doing that work for me. Most telling moment came when my son suggested, almost casually, that we move on and accept what had already been done. That was when I understood how deeply he had relied on finality as a weapon. He believed that once something was completed, it became untouchable. He had mistaken complexity for permanence. What he failed to see was that the truth does not need urgency, it only needs persistence. And by that point, persistence was the one thing I had more of than he ever anticipated. The final unraveling didn't come through confrontation, but through exposure, the quiet kind that leaves no room for denial. The attorney advised patience, and I followed it, even when every instinct urged me to speak. Instead of challenging my son directly, I allowed formal questions to surface through the proper channels. Requests for clarification became requests for documentation. Documentation became scrutiny. Scrutiny became discomfort. The buyers of my house were contacted, not with accusations, but with questions they hadn't realized needed asking. Timelines were reviewed. Authority was examined. The limited nature of the power of attorney was placed alongside the permanent consequences of the sale, and suddenly what had been presented as routine began to look irregular. I was informed, calmly, professionally, that there were grounds to challenge the transaction, not because of malice, but because consent had been assumed rather than confirmed. That distinction mattered. My son, sensing the shift, attempted to regain control by reframing the situation yet again. He spoke of stress, of misunderstandings, of good intentions gone wrong. But intentions do not erase impact, and stress does not grant permission. I watched as the confidence he once carried dissolved into careful phrasing and delayed responses. He stopped calling daily. When he did call, his voice lacked the authority it once held. He asked what I wanted now, the question arriving months too late to sound sincere. By then, the matter was no longer about the house alone. It was about restoring agency, about making it clear that decisions made without consent do not become valid simply because time has passed. I remained composed throughout, not because it was easy, but because composure kept the focus where it belonged, on actions, not emotions. The system that had so easily sidelined me was now being asked to listen, and it was doing so reluctantly but unmistakably. In that process, I felt something return to me piece by piece. Not the house yet, not closure, but recognition. And recognition, I learned, is the first step toward reclaiming anything that has been taken quietly. By the time the situation reached its most delicate stage, the emotional distance between my son and me had become unmistakable, not because I had withdrawn, but because the role he expected me to play no longer existed. He stopped speaking for me and began speaking around me, carefully choosing words, avoiding certainty, testing reactions. The authority he once wore so comfortably had been replaced by caution, and that change alone told me more than any apology could have. Meetings were no longer casual. They were scheduled, documented, and deliberate. Each conversation now included third parties whose presence made it impossible to dismiss my clarity or reinterpret my intent. I watched as professionals who had once accepted his explanations now addressed their questions directly to me, seeking confirmation rather than assumption. It was a subtle shift, but a decisive one. The sale of my house, once presented as irreversible, was now under review, its legitimacy dependent not on speed, but on consent. I was asked how I felt, what I wanted, what outcome I believed was fair. These were questions my son had never asked, believing he already knew the answers. When I spoke, I did so plainly, without dramatics, because truth spoken calmly has a weight that outrage never carries. I described the surgery, the timing, the absence of consultation, the relocation arranged without discussion. I explained the loss not just of property, but of dignity. No one interrupted me. No one suggested confusion. The silence in those rooms was different from the silence I had endured before. It was attentive, corrective. My son sat through those moments visibly unsettled, no longer in control of the story, no longer able to rely on familiarity to shield him. I did not look at him for reassurance or confrontation. I did not need to. What mattered was that the narrative had shifted back to where it belonged. He had acted under the assumption that age diminishes authority. What he was witnessing instead was the consequence of that assumption unraveling. And in that unraveling, something irreversible occurred, not just in the legal process, but in our relationship. Trust, once broken by convenience, does not return through explanation. It returns, if at all, through accountability. And accountability, I knew, was finally within reach. When everything finally settled, it didn't end with triumph or celebration. It ended with truth standing quietly where manipulation once lived. The sale of my house was halted, then formally challenged, and the assumptions that had allowed it to happen were laid bare one by one. I did not return to my old life unchanged, because experiences like this alter you in ways that cannot be undone. What I reclaimed was not just property or authority, but authorship over my own future. My son no longer spoke of what was best for me without asking. In fact, he spoke very little at all. The silence between us was no longer one of control, but consequence. I chose to live independently again, on terms I defined with boundaries that were clear and non-negotiable. I did not seek punishment or public humiliation. I sought recognition, and I received it. People who had once spoken over me now listened. Systems that had assumed my compliance learned to ask. If something like this has ever happened to you, if someone used your vulnerability, your trust, or your age to make decisions without your consent, I want you to share your experience in the comments, because stories like ours deserve to be spoken, not hidden. And if this story meant something to you, make sure you're subscribed. Don't underestimate the power of women. And Merry Christmas. God bless you and your family.